What is up, metal and heavy music fans? It's Flight of Icarus again with MetalTrenches.com, and it's time for yet another tier list. And today the topic is progressive death metal band Opeth. Very excited to talk about these guys. It's another band that I've been listening to for a pretty darn long time now. And I do want to preface this by saying this is going to stick to kind of the classic era Opeth albums, the heavy, harsh death metal albums. I'm not going to be getting really into their later stuff, the more progressive rock oriented albums, just because I haven't listened to them enough. I want to throw out there too that I deeply respect any band, as I've said many times before, that just like follows where their passion lies. And so if Ackerfeld's passion is really no longer in death metal music, then I'd rather he move on and continue to express himself in a genuine way with this more progressive rock direction influenced by sort of the 70s as opposed to what he was doing before. If that's where he is, I'd rather have him do that than sort of pretend and do sort of a put on, because I think a lot of bands just continue to do the same style that their fans want long past their prime and when they actually care about it, and it shows. So that out of the way, let's jump into the albums. And I'm gonna kind of try something a little different here. You all can let me know in the comments what you think of it, but I'm gonna kind of hop back and forth between the actual grid here and my digital albums to help sort of follow along. And so let's start in 1995 with the debut album Orchid. And I really enjoy this album. And the consensus seems to be that it's a pretty strong beginning for the band. In the Mist, She Was Standing is definitely like kind of their first really big song, kicking off really, just being Opeth from the very beginning with this 14 plus minute track, and then just a lot of longer songs on this album to begin with. I feel like a lot of other progressive death metal bands kind of like edge their way into it. It's like, okay, we'll start with like a 5-minute song and then we'll move on to all right, we'll try a 7-minute, 10-minute, and it goes from there. But no, like Opeth right from the beginning was like, we know what we're doing. I feel like it's rare for a band to just jump in so fully formed, but that's exactly what happened with this album. And there's a lot of pretty solid tracks on here. It's definitely not one of my favorites, but as far as just where it ranks in the overall discography, I think I would potentially give it a B. I just think it's fun to go back and re-listen to. It is one of the ones that I will continue to choose to go back to, and yeah, that'll do it for Orchid. So now let's jump to 1996 with Morningrise. Another really solid album right from the start here. This album's an interesting one for me in that there's not like the big standout like singles. Like there aren't tracks on here that I'd put into a playlist so much, but as far as like the album as a whole, as just one solid work, it's one of their stronger ones. Like I think it's really good, and so I would consider this one to be another B tier album, again, because it's sort of missing those like big tracks that like I really keep coming back to. And that's not to say that, I don't enjoy Advent a lot, and To Bid Farewell. I think that opening and the closer in particular are really strong, but it still sort of lacks sort of the like big single element that I feel like is important for an A tier or S tier album. Although that is not the only quality that's important, as we will see moving along here. Next up, we have one of my personal favorites, My Arms, Your Hearse. And if you ask me, this is one of the band's best albums. Easily, I would put this at S tier without question. This is easily an S tier album. It is one of the two main ones that I continue to reach for every single time. And as far as sort of like their early years and that 90s era sound, this is where it's at. Like, to me, this is the best one. And I have had quite a few arguments with people over this. Not that people don't like this album, but because they will choose a different album for this era over that. And so I might as well just get right into that. Let's not bury the lead here. I think a lot of Opeth fans would choose Still Life as their favorite Opeth album overall, not only just for the 90s era. But for me, I just don't feel the same way about it. I really love The More. I think it's one of the best songs that they have ever written, and I will consistently go back to that song. And like I said, I think having those big singles is an important part of having that big benchmark album. But if the rest of the songs don't stand up, then it doesn't really matter. If the things in between the singles aren't that great, are kind of meh, then it's not going to fall into that category. So for me, this is that album. Like, I think it has that really huge main single. I think Godhead's Lament is pretty solid. Serenity Painted Death, White Cluster is another great closer. But sort of in the middle, I find this album to be really middling, kind of boring. And I know right now a lot of people are smashing that dislike button and putting in those comments, you're stupid, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, this is just my opinion. I always laugh about how upset people get about differing opinions. If this is your favorite Opeth album, great. Like, I understand that the way you hear this album, the way it strikes you, may be very different from me. But for me, like, ultimately, I consider this to be kind of a C tier album. And again, I'm going to upset a lot of Opeth fans saying that. But let me just give me some credit here, because I've been listening to this band, you know, not since the 90s, but going back to the early 2000s, and continue to be a big fan of them to this day. I think that they are one of the most interesting kind of big mainstream death metal acts out there, and for good reason. I just, as far as like wanting to listen to them and the album that I will choose to reach for, this is kind of bottom of the list for me, and I know that's an unpopular opinion. So no no illusions here that like I'm in the popular realm when it comes to having that opinion. But let's move along to the other big one for me, and that is Blackwater Park. Now, I feel like this is an interestingly divisive album. I think partially because it's become sort of that, like, it's almost like a meme, I would say at this point, that like Blackwater Park is like the Opeth album, and it's sort of the normie album. I feel like seems to be sort of the diehard Opeth fan opinion. Maybe that's not the best word for it, but that's like the best description I can think of, is people see this as sort of like, it's such an easy album to like. And as a result, it people feel like, oh, it's more commercial, and like because everybody else likes it, it's not like the cool album to like. But this is a big album for good reason. I feel like most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time when an album blows up like this, it is for good reason. I have a lot of fond memories associated with this album back in 2001 too, because this is like early high school for me. And I remember I was still getting those metal magazines at this point, and there were a lot of ads showing off this artwork, and I was very intrigued with it. I had already been exposed to Opeth through one of my high school buddies. I forget particularly which album it was. I think he had Morningrise, and so that may have been my first exposure to them. But in any case, this album came out, and I remember hearing The Leper Affinity and just being like, holy shit, what is this? Like, this is something different. I would venture to say that this was my entry point to extreme progressive music, because I did grow up on some like progressive rock from my parents, but as far as like progressive metal, this was the beginning of all that for me. And I don't think I listened to any bands that had like 10 plus minute songs at this point either. So this was a big gateway in terms of kind of my understanding of broadening what it means to write a song, what songwriting can really look like, and how you can fuse that sort of In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida classic like 70s sound with metal. And it was just so different for me. But great, this is a good balance here, again, of like, you've got those big benchmark tracks like The Leper Affinity, like Bleak, The Funeral Portrait, and then everything in between is still really solid too. All the deeper cuts are also really engaging. This is just a consistently solid album, going all the way to the self-titled closer. And for it being over an hour, I'm really engaged every minute of it. I love that really kind of like bouncy sound that has just become their trademark over the years, so much so that like any other band that does it, it becomes Opethian metal, and I unabashedly use that term in my album reviews. And it's just they've sort of trademarked that quality, and you talk about like that bouncy guitar sound and people immediately know, and just that sort of like classic stuff gets stuck in your head. Really enjoyable. And ultimately I have to put Blackwater Park where I think it rightly belongs, at S tier, right up there with My Arms Your Hearse. So My Arms Your Hearse is my favorite 90s era Opeth album, and then Blackwater Park is my favorite 2000s era Opeth album. Let's move forward yet again. We've got the 1-2 punch of Deliverance and Damnation. And so this was kind of it's sort of a double album, but as I recall, they were released separately. You've got the acoustic album, and then you've got the heavier album. They're perfectly fine albums, but I feel like they do kind of rank low in the discography. I do like the track for Deliverance in particular, but that's kind of the only like big song I pick up off of these. Death Whispered a Lullaby is pretty solid in terms of what Damnation has to offer, but I prefer the heavier sound of the band, and I just feel like a lot of these feel almost like B-sides to me. That may be an unpopular opinion too, but I just don't feel like a lot. I don't hear a lot of people talking about these albums as much in the forums. I'm sure there are those, again, like diehard Deliverance fans. This may be an issue too, where I ran into with my Between the Buried and Me tier list, where I stated that The Great Misdirect is sort of like universally seen as their worst album, and boy was I wrong on that one. I got strung up by the ankles on that one and had to sort of retract that statement. So if I'm wrong on this too, by all means let me know. That's what the comment section is for, and I'm all for having a discussion on that. But personally for me, when it comes to both of these albums, this is again sort of C tier territory for me, potentially even like not necessarily in quality, but just again, just my opinion of like what I want to listen to. I might even start dropping things into D tier. But yeah, that's just like my opinion, man. But let's continue forward here. So then we got 2005 with Ghost Reveries, and this is a pretty solid album, especially for kind of moving into later in their career. You've got some big tracks on here like Beneath the Mire, and of course the Grand Conjuration, which just feels like such a classic sort of stadium live mainstay that people want to hear for good reason. And then the deeper cuts are pretty solid too. It's a little inconsistent. You've got some parts here and there where I start to sort of lose my attention. I do love the album art. I think it just really nicely captures sort of the vibe of this band in general. Ultimately, if I'm ranking it up against this other stuff, I would say that this is probably kind of B tier. That feels pretty good to me. But let's move on yet again to 2008 with Watershed. And this one too, like for kind of, this is their last like big heavy album, so to speak. And it's a really strong one. I hear mixed opinions on it, but I love, you've got Heir Apparent and you've got The Lotus Eater. So again, sort of your big singles. And then all of the other songs are consistently really solid too. Coil is really great. Burden is kind of a classic too. Like there's not a bad song on this album, and it's pretty consistently engaging, a little bit tighter than some of their albums too, like tight for Opeth being 55 minutes, which is kind of funny because usually tight for most bands is like anywhere from 35 to 40 minutes. But for them, that's a pretty short runtime, and it works well, I think. It makes everything sort of like pop all the more. So ultimately, I would say this is an A tier album. And I'd go so far as to say these are like the three albums that I listen to the most and find the most consistently enjoyable. And yeah, looking at this, I feel pretty good about it. And then, of course, again, you've got the later career albums where we're moving into more just sort of standard progressive rock overall. And so I just don't have enough of an opinion on those to really rank it. I don't feel like I'm the right person to even sort of talk about that style. It's just not something I know enough about or feel comfortable enough about anyways to really get into. So again, down in the comments, I'll be interested to hear what people think of those. But ultimately, it's like I have a massive amount of respect for them as far as what I've heard. I can tell that it's like very well played. It's just not for me. It's not really my style at this point. Maybe one day it will be. But yeah, ultimately, those are my ratings for the Opeth album. Don't go anywhere. But for now, Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.